Amidst a debauched French court, where a monarch's virility was often measured by his number of mistresses, Louis XIII stood as a shocking exception. He was a king who spent 23 years in a state of near panic at the mere thought of intimacy with women. Instead, he found his only salvation in the intense, obsessive bonds he formed with young men. History calls it friendship. But what kind of friendship drives a king to sign a formal love pact with a 19-year-old boy, or to hand over the entire army to a simple falconer? From the favorite Luynes to Cinq-Mars, these men held not only Louis XIII's heart, they held the destiny of France in their hands. The story begins not with triumph, but with desperation. At the turn of the 17th century, the Bourbon dynasty was hanging by a thread. King Henri IV, the beloved good King Henri, had saved France from decades of religious civil war, but he lacked the one thing that could secure the future: a legitimate male heir. The pressure was suffocating. Every cough, every fever, every day that passed without a son was a threat to the stability of the kingdom. When Henri's second wife, the formidable Italian heiress Marie de Medici, finally went into labor in September 1601, the entire nation held its breath. On September 27th, at the Château de Fontainebleau, the silence was broken. A son was born. The relief was explosive. Bonfires were lit on the hillsides, church bells rang out across Paris, and the king, usually a man of rugged stoicism, wept openly. He lifted the infant high and called him his little sword. They named him Louis. He was the Dauphin, the child of the miracle, the guarantee that peace would continue. But from the very first moments of his life, it was clear that Louis was not the robust warrior his father had hoped for. The birth had been difficult, and the infant emerged in a state of apparent death, purple and breathless. The midwives had to work frantically to massage life into his tiny lungs. It was a harrowing beginning, a foreshadowing of the fragility that would plague him for the rest of his days. We know more about the infancy of Louis XIII than almost any other figure in history, thanks to the obsessive documentation of his doctor, Jean Heroir. Heroir kept a journal that spanned decades, recording every meal, every bowel movement, every mood swing, and every word the young prince uttered. Through this microscopic lens, we see a childhood that was practically a medical experiment. The young Louis was subjected to a regimen of constant purging, bleeding, and enemas, treatments that likely did more harm than good and instilled in the boy a lifelong hypochondria and a fixation on his own bodily functions. He grew up as a solitary, melancholy child. While his father was a man of boisterous laughter and immense physical appetites, Louis was introverted and anxious. He developed a severe stutter, a humiliating affliction, in a court where wit and eloquence were weapons of power. When he struggled to speak, the courtiers would smirk behind their fans, and his father, impatient and disappointed, would often mock him. This ridicule drove Louis further into his shell. He learned early on that words were dangerous, that silence was safer. He found comfort not in people, but in animals. He spent hours in the gardens, training falcons and playing with his dogs, creatures that did not judge him and did not demand that he be anything other than a boy. His relationship with his parents was a source of profound confusion and pain. He worshipped his father, Henri IV. To Louis, Henri was a god, powerful, protective, the only barrier between him and the chaos of the world. Yet, Henri was also distant, often away on campaigns or in the beds of his many mistresses. On the other hand, his mother, Marie de Medici, was a source of coldness. She was a woman of immense political ambition, who viewed her son less as a child to be nurtured, and more as a pawn to be maneuvered. Louis craved her affection, but he rarely received it. Instead, he received strict discipline. He was whipped frequently, often for minor infractions, a practice that continued well into his teenage years and left deep psychological scars. He learned to associate intimacy with pain and women with control and rejection. Then came the year 1610, the year the world ended. Louis was 8 years old. France was prosperous, but tensions were rising. Henri IV was preparing for a war against the Holy Roman Empire, a move that angered the Catholic zealots in the country. The atmosphere in Paris was thick with paranoia. Prophecies of the king's death were whispered in the marketplaces. On the afternoon of May 14, 1610, the heat in Paris was stifling. King Henri decided to take an open carriage ride to the arsenal to visit his ailing minister, the Duke of Sully. He wanted to enjoy the air, so he dismissed most of his guard. It was a fatal mistake. As the royal carriage turned into the Rue de la Ferronnerie, a narrow, congested artery in the heart of the city, it ran into a traffic jam. A hay wagon and a wine cart blocked the path. The carriage came to a halt. The king was laughing at a joke, distracted. From the shadows of a shop doorway, a man emerged. His name was François Ravaillac, a towering, red-headed religious fanatic who had been stalking the king for days. Convinced that Henri was an enemy of the Pope, Ravaillac saw his chance. He placed one foot on a spoke of the carriage wheel and vaulted upward. Inside the carriage there was a flash of steel. Ravaillac stabbed the king violently in the chest. The blade grazed a rib. Henri cried out, "I am wounded!" But before his companions could react, Ravaillac struck again. This second blow was precise and devastating. It severed the king's aorta and pierced his lung. Blood gushed from the wound, soaking the royal doublet. The king's eyes rolled back. He slumped onto the shoulder of one of his nobles. "It is nothing," he murmured, the last words of the greatest king France had known in a century. Moments later, he was dead. Back at the Louvre Palace, the 8-year-old Louis was playing. He heard a commotion in the courtyard, shouting, the clatter of hooves, the wailing of women. The news traveled like a shock wave through the stone corridors. The king is dead. The king has been murdered. For a child, the death of a parent is always a trauma. But for Louis, it was a cataclysm. He was not just losing a father, he was losing his protector. The giant who had shielded him from his mother in the treacherous court was gone. And he had not just died, he had been butchered in the street. The violence of the act shattered Louis's sense of safety forever. In the hours that followed, the terrified boy was subjected to a grotesque ritual of succession. He was rushed into the room where his father's body had been laid out. He saw the blood. He saw the lifeless face of the man he had thought was immortal. He was made to sprinkle holy water on the corpse. Then, before he could even process his grief, he was dressed in purple mourning robes and paraded before the court. The Chancellor of France knelt before the small, trembling boy and declared, "The king is dead. Long live the king." At that moment, Louis ceased to be a child. He became Louis XIII. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, the weeping courtiers, the ambitious nobles already plotting their moves, and his mother whose eyes were dry and calculating, he felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. He was the king of France, but he was alone. The trauma of that day would fester in his mind, turning into a deep-seated paranoia and a melancholy that would never lift. The little boy who stared at his father's bloody body would grow up to be a man who saw threats in every shadow and who would spend his life searching for a replacement for the father he lost too soon. The years following the assassination of Henri IV were a dark winter for the young Louis XIII. While the ink was still drying on the proclamations declaring him king, The real power was being seized by the very person who should have nurtured him, his mother, Marie de Medici. History has painted Marie as a foolish, obstinate woman, and while there is truth to that, it underestimates her ambition. She had spent years in the shadow of her philandering husband. Now she was the regent of France. She wasted no time in dismantling Henry IV's legacy. Henry had hated Spain. Marie sought an alliance with them. Henry had been frugal. Marie opened the treasury doors and let the gold flow like water, mostly into the pockets of her Italian favorites. For the young Louis, the Louvre Palace became a prison. He was the king, yes, but he was treated like a nuisance, a piece of furniture to be dusted off for ceremonies and shoved into a corner when the real business of state was discussed. He was humiliated daily. While his mother's favorites walked the halls in silk and velvet, dripping with jewels paid for by the French crown, the king himself often wore threadbare clothes. He had to beg the treasury for pocket money to buy new birds for his aviary. The center of this humiliation was a couple that Louis grew to loathe with a burning, silent intensity: Concino Concini and his wife, Leonora Galigai. Leonora was Marie de Medici's foster sister and closest confidant. Her husband, Concini, was an arrogant Italian adventurer who had risen from nothing to become the Marshal of France, despite never having commanded an army in his life. Concini was the de facto ruler of the kingdom. He treated the boy king with open contempt. There are reports of Concini keeping his hat on in the king's presence, a grave insult in the strict protocol of the 17th century, and sitting in the king's chair while Louis stood. Imagine the rage building inside the teenage boy. He was the son of the warrior Henry IV, yet he was powerless, penniless, and bullied in his own home. His stutter worsened. His moods grew darker. He spent his days escaping the toxic atmosphere of the court, fleeing to the forest to hunt. And it was in the forest that he found his salvation. In 1611, a man named Charles dalbear, the Sieur de Luynes, caught the king's eye. Luynes was not a great noble. He was a minor aristocrat in his 30s, nearly 20 years older than Louis. But Luynes possessed a skill that the king valued above all else. He was a master falconer. He knew everything about birds. He knew how to train the hawks, how to stitch the leather hoods, how to read the wind. Louis, starving for affection and desperate for a father figure, latched onto Luynes. The older man became his constant companion. While the court gossiped that Luynes was just a servant, they missed the profound shift happening in the king's psychology. Luynes was the first person to listen to Louis. He was the first person to tell the boy that he was not stupid, that he was not weak, and that he was, by the grace of God, the king. Luynes was cunning. He saw the hatred Louis harbored for his mother and Concini. Quietly, carefully, while they were out in the fields waiting for a falcon to strike, Luynes began to whisper poison in the king's ear. "They are laughing at you, sire. They are stealing your kingdom. They will never let you rule." The breaking point began to form in 1614, when Louis was declared of legal age to rule. He was 13 years old. By law, the regency should have ended, but Marie de Medici simply ignored the law. She announced that she would continue to preside over the royal council. She forced Louis to sign papers stating he was too young and inexperienced to govern. It was a public emasculation. Then came the marriage. In 1615, to cement her alliance with Spain, Marie orchestrated a double wedding. Louis would marry the Spanish Infanta, Anne of Austria. His sister Elizabeth would marry the future King of Spain. The exchange took place on a floating pavilion in the middle of the Bidasoa River, the border between the two nations. Louis was 14. Anne was 14. They were two children pawned off in a geopolitical game, As we touched upon earlier, this marriage was doomed from the start, but in the context of 1615, it was just another chain binding Louis to his mother's will. He didn't want a Spanish wife, he didn't want to be touched, but he did as he was told. By 1617, the situation had become explosive. Concini was gathering a private army. There were rumors, likely planted by Luynes, that the Queen Mother planned to declare Louis mentally unfit and replace him with his younger brother Gaston, who was her favorite. Louis was now 15 and a half. He was terrified. He realized that if he didn't strike, he might not survive. But striking against his own mother and the most powerful man in France was a terrifying prospect. He had no army, he had no money, he only had Luynes and a handful of loyal guards. The conspiracy was hatched in the dead of night. It was a coup de majeste, a coup by the king himself. Louis and Luynes recruited the captain of the king's guard, a man named Vitry. The plan was simple and brutal. They could not arrest Concini. He was too powerful and had too many soldiers in Paris. He had to be eliminated. On the morning of April 24th, 1617, a tension hung over the Louvre. Louis feigned illness and stayed in his chambers, waiting, likely praying. Down in the courtyard, Concini entered the palace, surrounded by his entourage. He was dressed in his usual finery, arrogant and unsuspecting. Captain Vitry and a small group of guards approached him. "I arrest you in the name of the king," Vitry declared. Concini looked at him with disdain. "Me? Arrest me?" he scoffed, reaching for the hilt of his sword. That was the signal. Vitry cried out, "Kill him!" 3 pistols were fired at point-blank range. Concini was shot in the face and the throat. He collapsed onto the cobblestones of the Louvre bridge, dead before he hit the ground. His entourage fled in panic. Upstairs, the sound of the gunshots echoed through the stone walls. Louis was waiting by the window, clutching a musket, ready to fight if the plan failed. When the news was brought to him that the marshal was dead, the transformation was instantaneous. The shy, stuttering boy vanished. Louis climbed onto a billiard table so he could be seen by the crowding courtiers. He looked down at them, his eyes blazing with a mixture of relief and triumph. "Grand merci," he shouted. "Great thanks to you. As of this hour, I am king." The aftermath was gruesome, revealing the pent-up rage of the Parisians against the Italian favorite. The mob dug up Concini's body, dragged it through the streets of Paris, hacked it to pieces, and reportedly in a fit of savage frenzy, some even ate pieces of his heart. Louis showed no mercy. When his mother, hearing the commotion, asked what had happened, she was told that her closest friend was dead and that the king was demanding her departure. She was stripped of her power and exiled to the Château de Blois in the Loire Valley. Her other favorite, Leonora Galigai, was put on a show trial for witchcraft, accused of bewitching the Queen Mother, and was beheaded and burned at the stake. Louis did not intervene. He let the axe fall. He was done being a victim. At the age of 16, Louis XIII was finally the master of France. But as the dust settled, the court realized that one favorite had simply been replaced by another. Charles dalbear, the falconer, was created the Duke of Luynes and given all of Concini's confiscated wealth. He became the most powerful man in the kingdom. For Louis, this was a period of intense emotional release. He had killed the monster and banished the wicked witch. He now had his father by his side. But ruling a fractured kingdom was far harder than killing a man. The Protestants were rebelling in the south. The great nobles were furious at Luynes's rapid rise, and the king's marriage to Anne of Austria was already turning into a cold, barren wasteland. The boy had seized the crown, but he had yet to prove he could wear the weight of it. And looming on the horizon was a humble bishop, a man currently in disgrace, because of his association with the Queen Mother, who was quietly writing political treatises and waiting for his own moment to rise. A man named Armand Jean Duplessis, the future Cardinal Richelieu. With the blood of Concini scrubbed from the cobblestones of the Louvre, a new era began. It was supposed to be the era of Louis the Just, the king who had liberated himself from tyranny. But in reality, the chains had simply changed hands. The 17-year-old king had traded a mother he feared for a favorite he worshipped. Charles dalbear, the Duke of Luynes, was now the master of France. The relationship between Louis and Luynes remains one of the most enigmatic aspects of the king's life. It was intense, exclusive, and suffocating. Luynes blocked access to the king, filtering every letter and every visitor. He slept in the king's chamber, ate at his table, and directed his conscience. For Louis, who had been starved of affection his entire life, Luynes was the sun around which his world orbited. But for the rest of France, Luynes was a parasite. The nobility watched with grinding teeth as this minor country squire accumulated titles. He made himself a duke, a peer of France, and eventually the constable of France, the highest military rank in the kingdom, despite having zero military experience. The hypocrisy was staggering. Louis had killed Concini for usurping royal power, only to hand that same power to a falconer. But the greatest threat to this new regime did not come from the dissatisfied dukes. It came from the exile in the Loire Valley. It came from the mother. Marie de Medici was not a woman to fade quietly into history. Imprisoned in the Château de Blois, she seethed with rage. In February 1619, she orchestrated an escape that belongs in an adventure novel. The 45-year-old heavy-set Queen Mother, suffering from dropsy, managed to climb down a rope ladder from a window 120 feet above the ground in the dead of a winter night. She scrambled into a waiting carriage and fled to Angoulême, where she raised an army of rebellious nobles. This sparked one of the saddest and most bizarre chapters in French history, the Wars of the Mother and Son. Imagine the psychological toll on Louis. He was a teenager who had to mount a horse, draw his sword, and lead an army to fight the woman who gave birth to him. The conflict came to a head at the Battle of Pont de Sey in 1620. It was known as the drôlerie, or the funny little battle, because Marie's army of malcontents collapsed almost immediately against the king's forces. Louis was victorious. He had crushed his mother's rebellion, but he could not execute his own mother. The peace treaty was awkward and tense. They met in a field, embraced stiffly for the cameras of history, and wept fake tears. But the trust was gone forever. Louis knew that his mother would always choose power over him. While Louis was fighting his mother, Luynes was trying to fight the king's physiology. The favorite understood that for his own position to be secure, the king needed an heir. If Louis died childless, the crown would pass to his brother Gaston, who was an ally of the Queen Mother and a sworn enemy of Luynes. Therefore, Luynes became the relentless architect of the king's sex life. The situation in the royal bedroom had become a state crisis. Louis and Anne of Austria were completely estranged. They lived in parallel worlds within the Louvre. Anne surrounded herself with Spanish ladies in waiting, eating heavy stews, drinking hot chocolate, and gossiping in Castilian. Louis found her foreign and overwhelming. He was terrified of her sexuality. Luynes resorted to extreme measures. He bullied the king. He lectured him on religious duty. There are accounts of Luynes practically dragging the weeping king down the hallway to the queen's apartments, pushing him inside and locking the door. In 1619, there was a brief second honeymoon. Under Luynes's pressure, Louis resumed marital relations, but it was mechanical, a duty performed with grit teeth. Anne did conceive, But the joy was short-lived. She suffered a miscarriage. Louis, in his grief and awkwardness, didn't comfort her. He blamed her. He accused her of being careless. The gap between them widened into a chasm. By 1621, the fragility of Luynes' regime was showing. The Protestant Huguenots in the south of France were in open revolt, creating a state within a state. Louis, eager to prove himself a warrior king like his father, decided to march south to crush them. Luynes, the new constable of France, led the army. It was a disaster. They laid siege to the city of Montauban. The royal army was ill-equipped and poorly led. Disease swept through the camp. Thousands of soldiers died of typhus and dysentery in the mud. Louis watched his men die while Luynes issued incompetent orders. The king's adoration for his favorite began to curdle. He started to see Luynes for what he was, a greedy amateur. The tension in the royal tent was palpable. Louis began to snap at Luynes in public. The spell was breaking. But fate intervened before the king could discard his favorite. In December 1621, while the army was retreating from the failed siege, Luynes fell ill with purple fever. He died quickly. Louis's reaction to the death of the man he had loved so obsessively was chillingly detached. When the news was brought to him, he didn't weep as he had for his father. He didn't lock himself away. He reportedly looked at the body and said, "There is a great weight gone." The king ordered the camp to move on. Luynes' body was packed into a crate and strapped to the back of a mule to be taken away for burial. As the king watched the mule trotting away in the distance, carrying the man who had ruled France for 4 years, Louis remarked to a courtier, "There goes the King of Luynes." It was a moment of profound psychological insight. Louis XIII loved intensely, but when that love was betrayed or became a burden, he could shut it off like a tap. He was capable of a terrifying emotional coldness. With Luynes dead, Louis determined to rule alone. He was 20 years old. He wanted to be the absolute monarch, but the reality of governing a fractured nation was overwhelming. The royal council was a snake pit of arguing ministers. His mother, Marie de Medici, had returned to court claiming to be reformed and begging to be allowed back into the council. And in her shadow she brought a man Louis detested, Armand Jean Duplessis, the Cardinal Richelieu. Louis had known Richelieu for years. He remembered him as the Bishop of Luçon, the man who had served his mother during the dark days of the regency. To Louis, Richelieu represented the past. He was his mother's creature, a symbol of the Italian faction he hated. Whenever Marie suggested bringing Richelieu into the council, Louis shouted, "No, I will not have him. He is a man of secrets." But the state was crumbling. The finances were in ruin. The Protestant rebels were still strong. The nobles were plotting. Louis, suffering from chronic stomach pain and depression, sat at the head of the council table and realized he was not enough. He needed a mind sharper than his own. He needed a ruthlessness that matched the times. Marie de Medici played the long game. She positioned Richelieu not as her servant, but as the only man capable of saving Louis's kingdom. She wore the king down. In April 1624, exhausted and out of options, Louis XIII finally relented. He allowed Cardinal Richelieu to enter the king's council. It was supposed to be a temporary measure. Louis thought he could control the cardinal, use his talents, and keep him on a short leash. He didn't realize that he had just invited the true master of Europe into the room. The first meeting between the king and the cardinal was tense. Louis was sullen, defensive, his stutter pronounced. Richelieu was calm, respectful, bowing low, his red robe sweeping the floor. He told the king exactly what he wanted to hear. "I have no will but yours, sire. I am but a tool in your hand to make you the greatest king in Christendom." It was a lie, and yet it was the greatest truth. They were total opposites. Louis was a man of instinct and emotion. Richelieu was a man of logic and calculation. Louis was a soldier who wanted to be in the saddle. Richelieu was a bureaucrat who conquered the world from a desk. They disliked each other personally, but professionally, they were about to form the most effective, terrifying partnership in political history. The era of favorites was over. The era of the Iron Cardinal had begun. And for Louis, this meant a new kind of suffering, the realization that to be a great king, he would have to surrender his soul to a man he didn't trust. The year is 1624. The doors of the royal council chamber close, sealing inside two men who would change the face of the world. On one side, Louis XIII, 23 years old, plagued by chronic intestinal pain, suspicious and emotionally scarred. On the other, Armand Jean Duplessis, Cardinal, Richelieu, 39, gaunt, brilliant, and possessed of a terrifying ambition. They were an unlikely pair. Physically, they were both wrecks. They were both hypochondriacs who exchanged recipes for medicinal broths and compared symptoms of their migraines and hemorrhoids. But politically, they formed a singular organism. Louis was the body, the divine authority, the sword. Richelieu was the brain, the logic, the cold calculation. Richelieu whispered a seductive promise to the king. "I promise you, sire, to employ all my industry and all the authority which it has pleased you to give me, to ruin the Huguenot party, to abase the pride of the nobles, and to raise your name to its rightful place among the foreign powers." It was a manifesto of absolute power, but to achieve it, they first had to deal with the enemy within. On the Atlantic coast, the city of La Rochelle stood as a defiant monument to the past. It was the stronghold of the French Protestants, the Huguenots. Protected by massive medieval walls and the open sea, it was virtually an independent republic operating inside France. They had their own mayor, their own taxes, and their own navy. They traded with England, France's historic enemy. To Louis, a king obsessed with order and obedience, La Rochelle was an insult. It was a cancer in the belly of his kingdom. But the spark that lit the fuse wasn't just religious, it was personal. In 1625, the English Duke of Buckingham arrived in Paris to negotiate a royal marriage. Buckingham was everything Louis was not: flamboyant, dazzlingly handsome, dripping in diamonds. And he made a fatal mistake. He openly flirted with Louis's wife, Queen Anne of Austria. The scandal was electric. There were rumors of a secret meeting in a garden in Amiens, where Buckingham allegedly tried to embrace the queen, causing her to cry out. Louis was consumed by a cold, jealous fury. He banned Buckingham from French soil. In retaliation, Buckingham pushed England to support the rebels of La Rochelle. The war was on. In 1627, the royal army marched to the coast. The siege of La Rochelle would become the defining military event of Louis's life. It was here that he truly became a soldier. While Richelieu planned the strategy, Louis lived in the trenches. He refused the comforts of a royal pavilion. He slept on straw, ate the same hard bread as his men, and rode the perimeter under enemy fire. The soldiers loved him for it. For the first time, the quiet king looked like a leader. The problem was the sea. As long as the English navy could sail into the harbor and deliver food and gunpowder, La Rochelle would never fall. Richelieu proposed an engineering marvel that seemed impossible. They would block the ocean. Employing thousands of workers, they built a massive stone dike, nearly a mile long, across the harbor mouth. They sank hulks of old ships filled with stones. They chained logs together to create floating barricades. It was a feat of Roman ambition. When the English fleet arrived to relieve the city, They found the harbor sealed. They fired a few useless volleys and turned back. Inside the walls of La Rochelle, the nightmare began. The king and the cardinal decided to starve the city into submission. The siege dragged on for 14 months. Inside, the food ran out. Then the cats and dogs were eaten. Then the leather belts and boots were boiled for soup. Finally, the population turned to rats and grass. The descriptions from the time are horrific. Old men and children died in the streets, their mouths stained green from eating grass. The mayor of La Rochelle, Jean Guiton, had slammed his dagger onto the council table at the start of the siege and swore to kill anyone who spoke of surrender. But by October 1628, there was no one left to fight. Of the 27,000 citizens of La Rochelle, only 5,000 remained alive. On November 1st, 1628, Louis XIII rode through the gates of the ghostly city. The streets were littered with unburied corpses. The survivors were skeletal figures who could barely stand to bow to their king. It was a total victory. Louis had crushed the state within a state, but in victory, he showed a surprising political genius. He didn't massacre the survivors. He didn't force them to convert to Catholicism. He simply stripped the city of its walls and its privileges. He allowed them to worship as long as they obeyed. It was a master stroke. He destroyed their political power but avoided creating martyrs. However, just as Louis was celebrating his triumph, his own body betrayed him. In 1630, while campaigning in Italy, the king collapsed. He was seized by a violent fever and dysentery. He developed a massive abscess in his intestines. The royal physicians despaired. They bled him until he was white as a sheet. At Luynes, the king fell into a coma. The last rites were read. The court began to pack their bags, preparing to hail his brother Gaston as the new king. During this brush with death, 2 women sat by his bedside, weeping and praying: his wife, Anne of Austria, and his mother, Marie de Medici. In his delirium, Louis was vulnerable. The 2 women, united by their shared hatred of Richelieu, made their move. They blamed the cardinal for the war, for the king's exhaustion, for the ruin of the kingdom. They extracted a promise from the dying man: if God spares you, you must dismiss the cardinal. Louis, too weak to argue, nodded. But Louis did not die. The abscess burst, a grotesque but life-saving event, and the fever broke. As he slowly recovered, the Queen Mother came to collect her debt. This sets the stage for the most dramatic single day in the history of the French monarchy, November 11, 1630, the Day of the Dupes. The scene took place at the Luxembourg Palace in Paris, Marie de Medici's residence. The king arrived to visit his mother. She had locked the doors, ordering the guards not to let Richelieu in. She wanted the king alone. Inside the private cabinet, Marie unleashed a torrent of rage. She screamed at her son, listing Richelieu's crimes. She demanded his head. She forced Louis to choose. It is him or me, your mother or your servant. Louis was cornered. He hated confrontation. He stood pale and silent, picking at his buttons, unable to speak. Suddenly, a secret door opened. Richelieu entered. He had slipped into the palace through a private passage. Marie de Medici froze, then exploded. She turned her fury on the cardinal. She called him a traitor, a knave, a serpent. Richelieu, usually so composed, fell to his knees. He wept, kissing the hem of the Queen Mother's dress, begging for forgiveness. Louis, horrified by the scene, turned his back and fled the room. "Get out!" Marie screamed at the cardinal. "Get out!" Richelieu left, convinced he was a dead man. He went back to his residence and began burning his papers. The court erupted in celebration. The Red Tyrant was finished. The Queen Mother had won. The nobles flocked to the Luxembourg Palace to congratulate Marie, drinking wine and toasting the new era. Louis had ridden away to Versailles. which at the time was just a small hunting lodge in the swamps, not the great palace it would become. He wanted to be alone with his dogs. He was in agony. He loved his mother in a twisted, fearful way. But he knew that his mother was incompetent. He knew that without Richelieu, France would fall apart. It was the ultimate test of Louis XIII. Was he a son or was he a king? Late that afternoon, a messenger arrived at Richelieu's house. The cardinal was packing his bags for exile. The message was brief. The king commands your presence at Versailles. Richelieu arrived at the hunting lodge trembling. He entered the king's solar. Louis was not angry. He was calm. He looked at his minister and spoke the words that would seal the fate of France. "Cardinal," Louis said, "I honor my mother, but I am committed to my state. Continue to serve me as you have done." In one instant, the world flipped upside down. The king had chosen the state over his family. The retribution was swift. The next morning, the courtiers who had been partying at Marie's palace woke up to find they were on the wrong side of history. It was called the Day of the Dupes, because the seemingly victorious were made to look like fools. Marie de Medici was stunned. She refused to believe her son would do this. But Louis was ruthless. He eventually exiled his own mother from France forever. She would die years later, alone and in poverty, in Cologne. He never saw her again. Louis had secured his power, but the cost was his humanity. He had severed the last emotional tie to his family. He was now completely isolated with only the Red Cardinal as his companion in the gilded cage of power. And as the 1630s dawned with the internal enemies crushed, Louis and Richelieu turned their eyes outward. The 30 Years' War was raging in Europe, and France was about to enter the slaughter. But amidst the drums of war, a silent clock was ticking. The king was 30 years old, the queen was 30, and the cradle was still empty. By the mid-1630s, Louis XIII was a man haunting his own kingdom. He had exiled his mother, crushed the Protestant rebels, and handed the reins of government to Cardinal Richelieu. Together they had plunged France into the furnace of the 30 Years' War, declaring open conflict against both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. It was a clash of titans that would bleed Europe dry. But while the cannons roared on the frontiers, a colder, quieter war was being fought in the hallways of the Louvre. It was the war between the king and his wife. The situation with Queen Anne of Austria had become toxic. For Louis, she was no longer just an estranged wife. She was a national security threat. France was at war with Spain, her brother was the king of Spain, and Louis was convinced that she was a spy. His paranoia was justified. In August 1637, the king's fears were confirmed in a scandal known as the Val-de-Grâce affair. Richelieu's spies intercepted a series of secret letters Anne had written to her brother in Madrid and to other enemies of France. She was using the convent of Val-de-Grâce as a drop point for her treasonous correspondence. When the evidence was brought to Louis, he was livid. This was high treason. In any other circumstance, the culprit would face the axe. Louis summoned his wife to an interrogation that was humiliating in the extreme. He forced her to sign a confession. He purged her household, dismissing her favorite ladies-in-waiting. He stripped her of the little freedom she had left. The marriage was effectively over. Louis spoke openly to his confessors about annulment. He wanted to send her back to Madrid or lock her away in a convent forever. He was 36 years old, childless, sick, and married to a traitor. The Bourbon dynasty seemed destined to end with him. During this period of profound loneliness, Louis sought comfort in a series of strange, chaste relationships. He fell for two young women in succession, Marie de Hautefort and Louise de Lafayette. But these were not mistresses in the traditional sense. Louis XIII's sexuality remains a subject of endless historical debate. But one thing is clear: he craved emotional intimacy while recoiling from physical contact. He would spend hours with these women sitting just a few feet apart, talking about hunting, religion, and his own misery. He wrote them songs. He stared into their eyes, but he never touched them. When Louise de Lafayette, terrified by the court intrigue, decided to become a nun and entered the convent of the Visitation, Louis was heartbroken. He would visit her at the convent, sitting on one side of the iron grill while she sat on the other, talking for hours through the bars. It was the perfect metaphor for Louis's life. He could only love when there was a barrier to keep him safe. It was during these visits to the convent that the nun Louise began to urge the king. She told him that God was displeased with his hatred for the queen. She told him that for the sake of his soul and his kingdom, he must forgive Anne. Louis resisted. The idea of sleeping with his wife repulsed him. The doctors urged it. The cardinal urged it. The pope urged it. But the king remained stubborn. Then came the night that changed history. The date was December 5th, 1637. Louis had been at his hunting lodge in Versailles. He intended to travel to Cinq-Mars, passing through Paris. But as his carriage rumbled towards the capital, the sky turned black. A winter storm of biblical ferocity descended on the Île-de-France. The rain was so heavy that the roads turned into rivers of mud. The lightning was blinding. Captain Guiteau of the King's Guard approached the carriage window. "Sire," he shouted over the thunder, "it is too dangerous to continue to Cinq-Mars. We must take shelter in the Louvre." Louis scowled. The Louvre meant the Queen. Anne was staying there for the winter. Reluctantly, the king agreed. He arrived at the palace soaked and shivering. He went to his own apartments, intending to dine alone and sleep alone as always. But his apartments were unheated and unprepared. The furniture was covered in dust sheets. Guiteau, perhaps playing the role of destiny's agent, suggested that the king dine with the queen, whose apartments were warm and ready. Louis sighed and walked down the long, drafty corridor that connected their lives. The meeting was awkward. Anne was surprised to see him. They ate a silent dinner while the storm raged outside against the stained glass windows. When it was time to retire, the king discovered that his bed was not made up. There were no clean sheets. It was late. The storm was still howling. There was only one made bed in the palace, the queen's. We will never know exactly what went through Louis's mind in that moment. Was it a sense of religious duty? Was it the sudden, desperate loneliness of a man facing middle age with no legacy? Or was he simply tired? He entered the Queen's bedchamber. And on that stormy night, for the first time in years, the King and Queen of France slept together. The next morning, Louis left early. He returned to his hunting and his solitude, likely trying to forget the encounter. But weeks passed, then months. Anne's monthly cycle, usually regular, did not arrive. She felt a familiar sickness, but she dared not hope. She had lost 4 babies before. The court doctors were summoned. They examined her. They whispered. And then they announced the impossible. The queen was pregnant. Louis was skeptical. He refused to celebrate. He had been hurt too many times before. But as the queen's belly began to swell, a religious fervor seized the king. He believed this was a direct sign from heaven. In gratitude, he issued a royal decree dedicating the entire kingdom of France to the Virgin Mary, a tradition still celebrated in France today on the Feast of the Assumption. The summer of 1638 was tense. The entire nation prayed. If this baby died, or if it was a girl, the crisis would return tenfold. On September 5th, 1638, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Queen Anne went into labor. It was a difficult birth. Louis waited in the antechamber, pacing, twisting his hat in his hands. He was terrified. Finally, the door opened. The midwife presented a bundle. "Sire," she said, "it is a son." Louis XIII, The man of stone broke down. He fell to his knees on the floor. He insisted on seeing the child immediately to verify its sex. When he saw the boy, he lifted him up towards the window, towards the light, and said, "Behold, the God-given Louis Dieudonné." The news spread like wildfire. Strangers embraced in the streets of Paris. Wine flowed from the city fountains. The miracle child had arrived. The dynasty was saved. But for Louis, the birth of the Dauphin did not bring a romantic reconciliation. It brought a final relief. He had done his duty. He had produced the Messiah of the monarchy. Almost immediately after the birth, Louis withdrew again. He moved his bed back to his own apartments. He treated Anne with polite indifference. When a second son, Philippe, was born 2 years later in 1640, it was merely an insurance policy. Louis now focused all his remaining energy on preparing the kingdom for his son. He knew with the instinct of a chronically ill man that he would not live to see the boy grow up. He had to finish the war. He had to finish the nobles. He had to leave a throne so strong that even a child could sit on it without fear. And as his body began its final, slow collapse, Louis looked for one last companion to help him through the darkness. He found him in the form of a young man who would break his heart one last time, the Marquis de Cinq-Mars. By 1639, the court of France had become a place of suffocating gloom. The miracle had happened. The heir was born, but the king was dying by inches. Louis XIII was only 38 years old, yet he looked like a ghost. His digestion was ruined, his skeletal frame was racked with constant fevers, and his temper was blacker than ever. He wandered the corridors of Saint-Germain like a lost soul, bored, lonely, and desperate for a distraction from the crushing weight of the war with Spain. Cardinal Richelieu, whose own health was failing, watched the king with growing alarm. He knew that a bored king was a dangerous king. Louis needed a companion, someone to occupy his evenings, someone to listen to his music, someone to keep him docile while the cardinal ran the country. So with the cold calculation of a master chess player, Richelieu decided to handpick a new favorite for the king. He chose a young man named Henri de Rouzay, the Marquis de Cinq-Mars. Cinq-Mars was barely 19 years old. He was the son of an old friend of the cardinal, and he was breathtakingly beautiful. He was everything Louis was not: arrogant, athletic, fashionable, and brimming with the careless confidence of youth. Richelieu introduced the boy to the court, expecting him to be a compliant puppet, a pretty spy who would whisper the cardinal's praises into the king's ear. It was the greatest miscalculation of Richelieu's life. Louis didn't just like Cinq-Mars, he became obsessed with him. The relationship that developed between the middle-aged sick king and the teenage narcissist was one of the strangest spectacles in royal history. Louis showered the boy with titles. He made him the Grand Equerry of France, giving him control of the royal stables and the nickname Monsieur le Grand. But the emotional dynamic was pathetic. Louis behaved like a love-struck, insecure teenager. He was possessive and jealous. He demanded that Cinq-Mars spend every waking moment with him. When Cinq-Mars wanted to go out partying with his friends or chasing women in Paris, Louis would sulk and throw tantrums. We have the letters they exchanged. They read like the diary of a toxic romance. They fought constantly. Cinq-Mars would storm out of the room. Louis would write begging notes. At one point, the king actually drew up a legal contract, signed by both of them, laying out the rules of their friendship, promising not to keep secrets from each other. The King of France, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, was reduced to signing a best friend treaty with a 19-year-old boy. Cinq-Mars, however, was not content to be the king's toy. He was ambitious, and he was being manipulated by the king's enemies. He looked at the dying Cardinal Richelieu and saw an obstacle. He looked at the weak king and saw an opportunity. He decided that he shouldn't just be the grand equerry. He should be a duke, a peer, and eventually the successor to Richelieu himself. He began to poison the king's mind. In the long evenings when they were alone, Cinq-Mars would mock the cardinal. He would tell Louis that Richelieu was the real king, that Louis was just a shadow. He pricked the king's vanity. And Louis, who had always resented his dependence on the cardinal, listened. He didn't stop the boy. He let him talk. Emboldened by the king's silence, Cinq-Mars crossed the line from bratty favorite to high treason. In 1642, the French army was campaigning in the south near the Spanish border. The court moved to Narbonne. It was a scorching, hot summer. Everyone was sick. Louis was bedridden with intestinal ulcers. Richelieu was dying of pleurisy, coughing up blood. The government was paralyzed. In this atmosphere of decay, Cinq-Mars made his move. He entered into a secret conspiracy with the King of Spain, France's mortal enemy. The plan was terrifying in its scope. Spain would provide money and troops to support a rebellion in France. In exchange, Cinq-Mars would arrange for the assassination or exile of Richelieu and sign a humiliating peace treaty that would surrender French territory. It was a plot that would have destroyed everything Louis XIII had built. And the terrifying part was that Louis knew something was happening. He knew his favorite hated the cardinal. He may have even nodded along when Cinq-Mars talked about getting rid of the red tyrant. But Louis did not know about the treaty with Spain. That was the line he would never cross. Richelieu, even on his deathbed, was not a man to be underestimated. His network of spies was everywhere. In June 1642, a copy of the secret treaty between Cinq-Mars and the King of Spain landed on the cardinal's desk. Richelieu must have felt a grim satisfaction. He had the weapon he needed. He sent the document to Louis. The scene of the revelation is tragic. Louis was lying in his sickbed in Narbonne when the courier arrived. He took the papers. He read the proof that the boy he loved, the boy he had shaved, dressed, and adored, had sold France to the Spanish for a bag of gold. The illusion shattered. The king's face turned to stone. For Louis XIII, there was only one mistress he remained faithful to until the end: the state. The moment Cinq-Mars threatened the state, the king's love evaporated. Louis wrote a single, chilling order: capture him. Cinq-Mars was arrested, reportedly hiding in a house in Narbonne, trying to find a horse to flee. He was thrown into a dungeon. He couldn't believe it. He thought the king would save him. He thought their friendship treaty would protect him. He didn't understand that he was no longer dealing with Louis the lover. He was dealing with Louis the just. The trial was swift. Richelieu, too sick to travel by carriage, was carried up the Rhône River on a barge to oversee the proceedings. Cinq-Mars was condemned to death for high treason. On September 12, 1642, in the Place des Terreaux in Lyon, the execution took place. Cinq-Mars, just 22 years old, walked onto the scaffold. He was dressed in a magnificent suit of green velvet, looking every inch the fallen angel. He showed a flash of bravery at the end, refusing the blindfold. Back in Paris, hundreds of miles away, Louis XIII knew the exact hour the axe was scheduled to fall. He was standing at a window in the Louvre, looking at his watch. When the hand struck the hour, he turned to his courtiers and uttered one of the coldest lines in history. "Well," the king said, devoid of emotion, "I imagine Monsieur Legrand is making a funny face right now." It was over. The last favorite was dead. Richelieu did not survive his victory for long. The struggle had exhausted what little life he had left. In December 1642, the great cardinal lay dying in his palace in Paris. Louis went to visit him one last time. It was a strange farewell. They had been partners for 18 years. They had hated each other, needed each other, and made history together. Richelieu, gasping for breath, looked at the king and said, "Sire, I leave you your kingdom in the highest degree of glory and reputation." Louis nodded. He asked Richelieu for a final piece of advice. Who should replace him? Richelieu recommended Cardinal Mazarin, another brilliant Italian diplomat. Louis accepted the recommendation without argument. On December 4th, 1642, Richelieu died. The news swept through Europe. The Iron Cardinal was gone. Everyone looked at Louis XIII, expecting him to change. They expected him to recall his exiled mother, to make peace with Spain, to relax the heavy taxes. But Louis surprised them all. He did not change a thing. He kept Mazarin. He kept the war going. He kept the policies of the dead cardinal. In death, Richelieu had won the final argument. Louis had become the embodiment of Richelieu's state, but the king was a broken man. He was 41 years old, but he looked 70. His body was a wreck of ulcers, tuberculosis, and decay. He had no friends left. His mother was dead in exile. His wife was a stranger. His favorite was headless in a grave in Lyon. As the winter of 1643 approached, Louis XIII retreated to the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. He knew the end was coming. He could feel it in his gut, literally and metaphorically. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin, and Louis had one last duty to perform, to ensure that his 4-year-old son, the boy he hardly knew, would survive the shark tank of the French court. The year 1643 opened with a silence that was almost deafening. For nearly 2 decades, the heartbeat of France had been the thumping rhythm of Cardinal Richelieu's industry. Now the machine had stopped. The cardinal was in his tomb at the Sorbonne, and the king was alone at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. It is a chilling historical coincidence that Louis XIII returned to Saint-Germain to die. This was the palace where he had been happiest as a child, running in the gardens. Now it would become his mausoleum. The king's physical condition in the spring of 1643 was horrific. The autopsy would later reveal that his intestines were ravaged by tuberculosis and ulcers, and his lungs were filled with cavities. He was literally rotting from the inside out. He could barely eat. Anything he swallowed caused him excruciating pain. He wasted away until he was little more than skin stretched over bone, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity in his gaunt face. Yet, as his body failed, his mind became terrifyingly clear. Louis was possessed by a single final obsession, the survival of his son. He looked at the 4-year-old Dauphin, a small boy with golden curls and grave eyes, and he saw the future of the dynasty. But when he looked at the people surrounding the boy, he saw only wolves. There was his brother, Gaston, the Duke of Orleans, a man who had spent 30 years plotting against the crown. There was his wife, Queen Anne of Austria, a woman he had never loved, a woman he still suspected of being a Spanish spy at heart. Louis knew that the moment he took his last breath, these two would try to tear his legacy apart. He was determined to rule from the grave. He summoned his lawyers and his ministers to his sickbed. Between bouts of vomiting and fainting spells, the dying king dictated his last will and testament. It was a document born of deep distrust. Louis could not deny Anne the title of regent. It was her right as the mother. But he could strip her of the power. His will created a mandatory council of regency. Anne would be the figurehead, but she would not be allowed to make any decisions without the vote of the council. And who filled this council? The men of Richelieu, the men Louis trusted. He was trying to handcuff his wife to his own policies, even after he was dead. The scene of the signing of the will is a masterpiece of courtly tension. On April 20th, 1643, the king ordered the queen and his brother to his bedroom. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and incense. Louis, propped up on pillows, forced them to listen as the document was read aloud. He forced them to swear on the Holy Gospels that they would obey it. Anne wept. Gaston looked solemn. They swore the oath. But Louis, staring at them with his sunken eyes, likely knew it was a charade. He reportedly whispered to a trusted adviser later, "They will break my will as soon as I am dead, but I have done what I can." As April turned to May, the end drew near. The king's suffering was Job-like. He was plagued by bed sores and could not find a comfortable position. Yet observers noted a strange transformation in his personality. The moody, anxious, stuttering man disappeared. In his place was a figure of calm, almost saintly resignation. He spent his waking hours composing music, polyphonic psalms to be sung, at his funeral. He chatted with his doctors about the anatomy of his own disease with a detached curiosity. He had become Louis the Just in the truest sense, judging himself, preparing his soul, stripping away the vanities of the world. There is a famous, poignant anecdote from these final days that captures the tragedy of the father-son relationship. The little Dauphin, the future Sun King, was brought to his father's bedside. The boy had been baptized hastily at birth, but now with the king dying, the formal ceremonies were rushed. The child was dressed in adult clothes, looking tiny and fragile in the gloomy room. Louis XIII beckoned the boy closer. His voice was a rasp. "My son," the king asked, "do you know who you are?" The little boy, perhaps confused by the gravity of the moment, or perhaps showing a flash of the ego that would later define him, piped up, "I am Louis XIV." The dying king smiled sadly. He reached out a skeletal hand. "Not yet, my son," he whispered. "Not yet, but pray to God that it will be soon." It was a torch-passing moment, the setting sun acknowledging the rising sun. On May 13th, the physicians told the king that he would not survive the night. Louis received the news with relief. He said, "God be praised. I have never heard better news." He called for his guitar. He was an accomplished musician and tried to play a final song, but his fingers were too weak to hold the chords. He laid the instrument down, closing the chapter on the only true passion of his private life. At 2:15 p.m. on May 14, 1643, Louis XIII stopped breathing. The struggle was over. The lonely king was dead. The moment the physician confirmed the death, the room erupted, not with grief, but with movement. The courtiers turned their backs on the corpse almost instantly. They rushed toward the terrified 4-year-old boy standing nearby. "The king is dead. Long live the king." But the real drama happened in the hallway. Within an hour of Louis's death, while his body was still warm, Queen Anne was already holding secret meetings. She was done being the victim. She was done being the Spanish spy. She was now the mother of the king. Louis XIII had tried to rule from the grave, but as we shall soon see, his carefully constructed will would not survive him for long. Yet, in his failure, he succeeded. He left behind a nation that was centralized, a military that was feared, and a throne that was absolute. He had built the pedestal. Now his son would climb onto it and dazzle the world. But before we close the book on this misunderstood life, we must look at the legacy. What did it all mean? The pain, the silence, the cold nights, the blood on the scaffold? Was Louis XIII a monster, a failure, or a genius disguised as an invalid? The body of Louis XIII was carried to the Royal Basilica of Saint-Denis, the final resting place of French kings. His funeral was solemn, dignified, and surprisingly brief. Paris was already moving on. The eyes of the world had shifted from the cold, dead face of the father to the golden curls of the son. In the weeks following his death, the prediction Louis made on his deathbed came true with brutal speed. His widow Anne of Austria walked into the Parlement of Paris. She was dressed in deep mourning black, but her spirit was triumphant. She demanded that the king's will, the document he had spent his dying breaths dictating, be declared null and void. The magistrates agreed. The restrictions were lifted. Anne became the absolute regent. She appointed Cardinal Mazarin as her chief minister, and, if the rumors are to be believed, perhaps her secret husband. The Spanish spy and the Italian schemer were now in charge of France. It seemed on the surface that Louis XIII had lost. His wife had outmaneuvered him. His brother was back at court. His specific orders were ignored. But if we look deeper, we see the ultimate irony. Louis XIII had won the war that mattered. Anne and Mazarin did not dismantle the king's work. They accelerated it. They used the absolute power that Louis and Richelieu had forged. They used the centralized army Louis had built. They used the tax systems Louis had enforced. When the nobles rose up one last time in a rebellion known as the Fronde, a few years later, the monarchy survived only because Louis XIII had made the throne too heavy to be overturned. So, how should history judge this enigma of a man? For centuries, Louis XIII has been the victim of bad PR. He is often remembered merely as the weak, passive foil to the brilliant Cardinal Richelieu, or as the gloomy prologue to the spectacular reign of Louis XIV. He is the melancholy king, the chaste king, the man who didn't like to talk. But this view is a mistake. It confuses silence with weakness. Louis XIII was, in reality, the architect of modern France. Before him, France was a loose collection of feudal territories, run by warlords and dukes who ignored Paris. After him, France was a nation-state. He was a man of terrifying contradictions, and that is what makes him so human. He was a devout Catholic who allied with Protestants to break the power of the Habsburgs for the good of the state. He was a man who craved love desperately, falling for Luynes, for Cinq-Mars, for Marie de Hautefort. Yet he ruthlessly sacrificed those loves the moment they threatened the stability of the crown. He was a hypochondriac who was afraid of drafts and bad food, yet he personally led his armies into the trenches, sleeping in the mud and facing cannon fire with a stoicism that shamed his generals. And then there is the matter of the Sun King. We look at Versailles today, that sprawling palace of gold and mirrors, and we see the ego of Louis XIV. But the core of Versailles, the brick and stone hunting lodge that sits at the very heart of the palace, was built by Louis XIII. He chose the spot. He built the retreat. This is the perfect metaphor for their relationship. Louis XIII provided the structure. Louis XIV provided the decoration. The son could afford to be the son only because the father had been willing to live in the shadows. Louis XIV could dance in ballets and dress as Apollo only because Louis XIII had spent 20 years in the saddle, grimly crushing rebellions and securing the borders. The father's trauma became the son's security. Louis XIII lived a life defined by absence. The absence of a father he lost too soon, the absence of a mother's love, the absence of marital intimacy. He filled that void with a manic devotion to duty. He viewed his kingship not as a privilege to be enjoyed, but as a cross to be borne. In the end, his story is a tragedy, but it is a necessary tragedy. History loves the charismatic figures, the Henri IV, the Louis XIVs, the Napoleons. It rarely loves the introverts. It rarely loves the men who stutter, who suffer from chronic pain, who find social interaction agonizing, but who show up to work every single day and make the hard, unpopular decisions. Louis XIII was the winter king. He was cold, severe, and often bleak. But it is the winter that kills the pests, hardens the ground, and prepares the earth for the harvest. Without the winter of Louis XIII, there would have been no summer of the Sun King. As we leave him now, resting in the crypt of Saint Denis, let us remember him not as the king who refused to touch his queen, nor as the puppet of the Red Cardinal. Let us remember him as he saw himself in those final musical days at Saint-Germain, a weary traveler laying down a heavy burden, having walked a long, lonely road so that France could finally learn to run. He was Louis the Just. And perhaps after 300 years of being overshadowed, it is finally time to give him his justice.